Somebody dial me in there. Okay, so who read Revelation this week?
I read part of it, just not like up to where we're supposed to be at.
Alright, that makes it harder. Much harder, because we're going to be covering stuff for the first time today that you never heard. If you haven't familiarized yourself with it, it's really hard to pick it up and run with it in a short period of time. But if we're going to get through it this year, we have to cover it this way. Which means you have to keep up. Or you're not going to get a whole lot out of class. But this might knock my marker off.
Your daughter gave me a pen this morning, so I just
That's
had
nice of her. Okay. Last week, what did we cover at the tail end?
Well, at the very end, it was talking about the idolatry in the church
Okay.
at the time.
All right. Back in chapter 7, we saw that a complete number of people came out of Israel, and this huge number by comparison came in from all the nations of the earth, the Gentiles. And that's still happening today because we are,
Gentiles.
all right, Gentiles then Christians, right? We are non-Jews that converted to Christianity. You skip down all the way down into chapter 9. At the very tail end, you see God dumping out punishment over and over and over as a way to both punish these people and try to get them to come back to Him. And they will not do it. You see that in verse 20 of chapter 9. That's kind of the focus I want us to see out of last week. Is that God was trying to bring these people back and they just wouldn't do it. And that's consistent with how humanity has treated God, by and large, throughout the majority of human history. Most people just, no matter what God does, turn Him away and have nothing to do with Him. Okay, so jumping down into chapter 10, something different happens here in chapter 10 compared to what we've seen. Another mighty angel coming down out of heaven, wrapped like a cloud. I want us to ask ourselves who this angel is. What does angel literally mean?
Messenger.
Messenger, right. It doesn't literally mean a humanoid figure with white wings and a white robe and a blue sash and they have a halo floating around their head. Angel just literally means messenger. Alright, so we need to view that this way here. I saw another messenger coming down from heaven, wrapped in a cloud with a rainbow over his head, and his face was like the sun and his legs like pillars of fire. What imagery does this remind us of in Revelation? Who have we seen described in a manner similar to this earlier in this book? Jesus, right? Jesus. It makes sense that this messenger is Jesus. Look at how it is. He's wrapped in a cloud with a rainbow over his head. What does that rainbow symbolize?
Promise.
All right, God's covenant keeping that is continuous from all the way back in Noah's time, all throughout eternity. His face was like the sun. Remember, that is the exact way that Jesus was described. You can't look directly into the sun and see anything. It's blinding. All right, that's the same way Jesus is described here as well. And his legs are like pillars of fire. All right. He had a little scroll open in his hand. By comparison to the previous scroll had 7 seals. It had to be very large to make that happen. This one is small and it's already open. Whenever you look at how he sets up, I skipped ahead. No, I didn't. Whenever he sets down, he puts his right foot on the sea and his left foot on the land. That is weird. Why would he do that? Like, he couldn't just sit down in the dirt out here and put his feet on the ground and give this message to John. Why did he put his feet on the land and the sea?
Was it to remind him like that he's in control of both?
Yes, actually, yes. All right, it's showing that he has power and authority over the entirety of the earth. There's nowhere you can go in this world that is not land or sea. All right, the entirety of the earth's surface is covered in land or water. So it's showing his complete dominion over the entire earth. Good that you picked that up. Whenever he calls out, his voice was like a lion roaring, right? That a lion is courageous and and is attention getting. If you've ever watched any movie based around the jungle, whenever a lion roars and there's people nearby, they automatically go, "Where's that lion?" All right, it's an attention getter. Seventh thunder sound. He's about to write down everything that he heard in the thunders, and God tells him, "No, don't do that." It's really interesting that there's part of the message that isn't revealed here. All right, there's something that John heard, and he wanted to write it down and share it with everyone, and God told him, "No, don't do that." Why would he do that?
Was it something that they could figure out themselves if they looked up to God?
Not necessarily. Possibly, but not necessarily.
Just assume we were meant to have it.
That's the easy answer, right? And I think that a lot of times the easiest answer is the right answer. We just didn't need it. All right? And there's a lot of times whenever we look through the entire Bible, especially the New Testament, you're like, I want a little bit more information. I want a little bit more detail. I would like to know something else that happened, a little more background. I would like them to spell something out for me that's not there. We just don't have to have it. Anytime we look at something that we think is missing, we can remember that the God that created the universe and set up the church and had this masterful plan in place before humanity ever sinned is the one that chose exactly what would be left behind, the exact words, what would and wouldn't be in here. So we don't need to question God on why he doesn't put something in there. We can it's not wrong to want to know some of the details that aren't there, as long as we keep in mind that we don't have to have it to be saved. We don't have to have it to do what God wants us to do.
I think it's also really awesome that that was put in there because it's just a reminder that the entire Bible is an inspired work, and that God was the ultimate editor of it.
Yeah, it's always interesting to me whenever you see certain words that are in the Scripture, because we have a limited amount of space. I mean, God could have made a stack of books as big enough to fill up this whole bookcase and have that as the Bible, but he chose this. Every one of us has a copy right there, and we have a limited space that it takes up. So every time God puts something in, it's important. It takes up a limited amount of space in a limited area, or an area of space in a limited area, and that makes it important. So that's a good point. Look at the days of the trumpet call to be sounded by the seventh angel. The mystery of God would be revealed, just as he announced to his servants, the prophets. Okay, whenever you go back and you look at Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, we see some things that happened with the prophets that we don't necessarily pick up when we read about the prophets. Whenever Isaiah was prophesying about Jesus, did he have a complete understanding of what he was prophesying? No, he didn't. He was relaying the message that God had given him, but he didn't have a full and complete understanding of what that meant. Whenever you go to the book of Hebrews, it says that the prophets wanted to know what was going to happen. That's paraphrasing a little bit, but they wanted to know what the message they were relaying meant sometimes. And so whenever we see this, we see that just because we don't know what God hid from us here, what God didn't allow us to see with the seven thunders, what we need to know will be revealed in time. So we can't question the timing of God. Those prophets really wanted to know what God was talking about whenever he sent the message that they received and they relayed to people. But they didn't get the full understanding. We got the full understanding whenever Jesus came and the church was established. Here, the things that aren't revealed, if they need to be revealed, they will be revealed at the appropriate time. The same way God has a history of doing that in the Old Testament to the New Testament. Oh, I don't think we're going to make it. Going down to the part where he eats the scroll. This is really weird. We see Ezekiel do this as well in his apocalyptic prophecy. So John takes the little scroll, he eats it, and it's in his mouth it's as sweet as honey, in his stomach it's bitter. Has anybody ever eaten themselves sick on sweets? Yeah, I think that's like a rite of passage as a kid.
It is. It is.
You
didn't
find
do that
something.
on Halloween. You didn't have it.
You find something that is delicious and you eat so much of it that your stomach gets upset. In this case, John really wants to know what's in this scroll. I mean, as a student, as an apostle, as a man of God, we go back and we look at the scroll with 7 seals, and whenever it couldn't be opened, and Jesus hadn't come up yet to open it up, John cried. A grown old man cried because he wasn't going to get to know what that scroll meant. So whenever you have a message that is being revealed to John, he is passionate. He wants that message for himself and for the good of the church as well, because John was the last living apostle at the point when this was written. He was the lone apostle left to help guide the church. He wants that message. So whenever he gets it, it's sweet in that he gets this message revealed to him. And a lot of times that's how it is for us. Whenever we look at a message from God, it's sweet. It's great. We love it, and we gobble up as much of it as we can get. But then, on the backside of that, whenever you have to relay that message to people, it's bitter a lot of times. Right? Whenever you learn that you're saved, and there's the ability to be saved, and you're not saved, you become saved, and then you have this knowledge that you share with people. The downside of that, the bitter part of that, is you can look at people in your life and go, that person is not living the way God wants. I mean, no doubt about it, they are doing the exact opposite of what God says to do. And that means if they die in that state, they're going to go to hell. That's not being judgmental. That is simply reading what God says and judging the fruits of their labor. The Bible says that is okay to do. That's bitter, right? That's bitter to look at somebody in your family, look at somebody you love, and see that their fruit is not what God says it should be. So there's a bitter downside to having this knowledge, right? After you digest that message and it comes John's point to turn around and relay this message, do you think that it was hard for John to get this beautiful vision and have this miraculous knowledge that he's bound to share with the rest of humanity? But he has to engrave for the rest of mankind's history that 5 of the 7 churches were doing terribly. He had to write to people he loved and cared about and tell them, if you don't straighten up, you're going to go to hell. That's hard. That's bitter. I don't know if you've ever been in a position where you have to look someone square in the eyes and tell them, that's not right. You're not doing what God says, and you know what the repercussion of that is. That's hard. It's bitter. It's not something that makes you click your heels and jump for joy. Look up here at the tail end of verse 10. You must again prophesy about many peoples and nations and languages and kings. A lot of this book is a judgment on the people that are going to persecute the church, on the people that are going to fight God. And the people that are for God, the people that are serving God, it is to bolster them. It is to make them know that it's worth doing whatever it takes, no matter what you face, despite what all these other people there that are going to get judgment rained down on them. It's still worth serving God in the end. But for everybody else that isn't serving God, it is a judgment sentence here. Going into verse 11. verse 11. Chapter 11. He was given a rod like a staff. Who else was given a rod like a staff and told to measure something in the Bible? Ezekiel. Ezekiel was. When's the last time you heard a good class or sermon out of Ezekiel? It's a really hard book to go in and just get sermon material and turn around and turn it into a sermon, or get class material and teach a class out of it. It's a huge book. It's a large undertaking, and it is a lot of this. You can't just fluff your way through Revelation, read it a little bit, and go, oh, okay, I get that. You have to dig down and think about it really hard, because we're not living when they lived. You have to do the same thing with Ezekiel and Daniel to get everything you should get out of it. But whenever you do that, I haven't went back and studied Ezekiel nearly as well as I should, but when you do that, it's much easier to make the correlation. Oh, Ezekiel was given a measuring rod. I happen to know that from something else. He's given a measuring rod. This is consistent with the message we see in Ezekiel. He was told, rise up and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there. What's weird about this? Whenever he's told to go measure the temple, what's weird about this?
Temple isn't an existent thing.
Temple's not there anymore, right? Whenever Ezekiel was told to do this, the temple was right there. Right? The temple was right there. He could go take a stick if he needed to and measure down the side of it and see how long it was. What is the temple at this point when John is told that?
It's been destroyed.
Okay, but there's still a temple here. There's still a temple. Not a physical temple, but what is the temple?
The church.
The temple is the church. The temple is us. We are the temple of God. So the measuring being done here is the measuring of the church. It's the measuring of the church and the altar and those who worship there. What was significant about the altar at the temple?
It's where sacrifices were made.
All right, the altar is where the sacrifice was made. If you had to bring in a calf or pigeons or whatever, you would kill it, and it would be offered at the altar outside of the actual temple building. All right, it was all part of the temple complex that God set up, and those who worship there. All right, so we are the temple. We are the church at this point. We make sacrifices in our lives, and we are supposed to worship God in spirit and in truth, according to John 4:24. Right? So he's being given a measuring rod for the church. We see that back in chapters 2 and 3. He measured them out. All right, he weighed them out, and 5 of the 7 were found out of order. Right? They were found out of dimension with what they should have been. He says, do not measure the court outside of the temple. When the temple existed in Herod's day, he had added, if this is the temple grounds, he added an outside court around the temple. And that was where Gentiles could go, but they couldn't go into the actual temple grounds. That was never specified by God. God never said, make a courtyard for the Gentiles. Right, it was nice for the Gentiles, but it really did nothing for the Gentiles because they served no purpose to go in and worship God. Because the Gentiles did not worship God, or else they would have been proselyte Israelites. So they had no business surrounding the temple and doing anything there on the temple ground. So he's saying, don't measure that. That is not a part of what you're supposed to be measuring. In the same way, we don't need to be adding on things of the world into the church. We don't need to be adding in things that aren't specified by God to the church. Let's go down. These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands, talking about the 2 witnesses that will prophesy for a big number of days. I want us to notice about the 2 witnesses here is that they're clothed in sackcloth. What is the purpose of sackcloth?
It's a symbol of mourning.
All right, it's a symbol of mourning, but there's something about it that it does to the person that wears it.
It's uncomfortable.
It's
Scratches
very
your
uncomfortable.
wrists.
It's scratchy. They put it on whenever they're mourning, especially, to make them uncomfortable. So they're not comfortable through their pain. It's kind of like a really really low grade form of self torture almost. It scratches and rubs and makes you itchy. It's very, very uncomfortable. So they're putting themselves in this uncomfortable state. In this case, they are prophesying while they're in sackcloth. They are torn up about the message that they're relaying. All right, they're torn up about the state of the church and what is happening, and they are prophesying, and it moves them greatly.
I had a question about like the cloths and such. Is it their version of like they don't want to go through the pain, so it's a quick way to get themselves out of that pain?
No, it was a way to make themselves uncomfortable so they would be able to focus on the bad things that had happened, if that makes sense. It was a weird ritual.
So instead of like thinking through the problem and solving that, they wanted to just keep going through with the pain until
There's no
pain's
way
gone?
to solve what was happening. All right, whenever Job's family was killed, there's no way to solve that. So he put on sackcloth and was miserable as a part of the mourning process for him. The same way some people mentally walk themselves through things that happen that are outside their control, if that makes sense. It's like burlap. If you've ever been around burlap, imagine wearing a shirt and pants and underwear made out of burlap, and how uncomfortable that is. It just puts you in an uncomfortable state as part of the mourning process.
So how do they know when they're over that? Especially since there's all that extra pain.
They were usually set time periods, but it was always an extended period of time. We're talking days and days of wearing this as a part of the mourning process. They didn't just have a funeral, shake some people's hands, and get over death in the family most of the time.
It could also be for penitence.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Whenever Jonah went to Nineveh, the king and all the people were called in, the king was torn up, repented, wore sackcloth, called the entire city into repentance, and they all wore sackcloth as part of the penitence. That's a good point. All right. So these two witnesses are very moved by the message that they have to bring and what's happening. Look down in verse 5. If anyone would harm them, fire pours from their mouth and consumes their foes. If anyone would harm him, this is how he is doomed to be killed. If you look at Jeremiah went through some horrible time periods like we talked about in the book of Lamentations when we studied that. But Jeremiah was told, your words will be as fire pouring from your mouth. All right, so they had a message that would just consume people whenever they delivered it. It talks about the powers that they had. I don't think this is a literal futuristic, these people are going to do these miraculous events, because this is the last key piece of the Bible, the last text that needed to be added to the Bible. So once the Bible was completed, were miraculous works needed anymore from that point on? No, because the entire message had been delivered, that it didn't need confirmation, and that was the purpose of miracles, was to confirm the message. But when you look back through the Old Testament, it talks about shutting up rain. Who do we see doing that? Elijah, right? Elijah called in a years-long drought just by asking for it to happen to God. And then at the same time, he was further down the road, at the end of it, he was able to call rain down like it was nothing by the power of God. That's just a good example. You go down to Sodom and Egypt. What was Sodom renowned for?
It's sin.
All right, it's sin. Sodom was one of 4 cities on a plain that was wiped out by fire and brimstone by God himself from heaven. That is how bad their sin was. They were used as an example of not to let your life be consumed by sin. You find that back in Genesis. So, Sodom was renowned for sin. What was Egypt also renowned for?
Was it
Idolatry.
You go ahead.
Idolatry.
Idolatry, right? Whenever you look back at Egyptology, you don't find the Egyptians worshiping God and just messing some details up and like having an idol but still calling it God and sacrificing to the one true God, right? You find them worshiping the sun, the moon, death, the river, everything. They have gods all over the place. Polytheism at its finest. They have like all these weird rituals, and they have this massive idolatrous priest system, even back in the 1400 BC era when Moses brought them out. They were a center of idolatry, the same way that Greece became, and then later Rome became. We see Egypt doing that before either of those two city-states. We see Egypt as a center of idolatry. That idolatry permeated throughout everyone around them, and it also corrupted the Israelites to a degree. Whenever you see them coming out of Egypt, what are they doing? Let's go back to Egypt. Let's set up a golden calf, just like they had back in Egypt. We see a lot of that permeating throughout the body of God at that time on earth. We see that happening a lot today whenever people of the world influence the church.
How did they do that? I just don't get it. I feel like I have a hard enough time pleasing one God. I can't imagine having happened.
Well, all right, here is the appeal of polytheism that we struggle with sometimes, because it seems stupid to us, right? But the appeal of polytheism is you get to pick your favorite, and that is the one that you serve. So if I am a person that... All right, let's go this route. If I'm a person that craves battle, this is not the route I was going to go, but it's probably a little bit easier to talk about. If I'm a person that craves battle, I love to fight. I love stabbing people to death and hacking them to pieces with my sword. Who am I going to pick in Greek theology to be my god?
Aries.
Ares, right? The god of war. Like he's my jam in that case. I'm going to serve him and use him as a method to fuel my love for fighting. In a way, it's self-worship. You pick your favorite thing about a god, and it's something you usually identify with yourself, and then you worship them. So it's essentially a form of self-worship via a third party, if that makes sense. That's kind of an oxymoron, but that is the appeal of polytheism that we have trouble grasping. You get to pick your favorite and run with it. Whatever floats your boat. And hey, if you don't like Ares and you become somebody that decides to love books and knowledge, you can go to Athena, and Athena is the goddess of knowledge, and all of a sudden she's your favorite because that's what you love in your life at the time. All right. We are probably not even going to make it through chapter 11, but I hope we do. All right. We see them killed. These two prophets were killed. The earth parades their bodies around as a symbol of triumph. And then, after 3.5 days, a breath of life from God entered them. They stood up. Everybody was spooked. And then they rose to heaven. This didn't literally happen. But it's a reminder of Christ and the resurrection and his ascension, all of which are a promise to us. If Jesus was resurrected, then the resurrection promise from God is true. If Jesus ascended, then the ascension promise for Christians is true. So it's a reminder that Jesus died. Right? His death was touted as a victory by everybody that was played a key part in getting him dead, including Satan. But then whenever Jesus came back to life after the appropriate time, everything fell to pieces for the people that thought they won. He rose by the power of God like no one else ever had before. And then, after the appropriate time, he ascended to heaven. So that is what Christians that are faithful have to look forward to. Right? Even if you're killed by a Roman chopping your head off, even if you're stoned to death by the Jews, even if you're thrown off a bridge or the top of a building in a Muslim country today, no matter what happens to you, you have that promise, and it's worth it. Going down to the seventh trumpet. The seventh angel blew his trumpet, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, "The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ. He shall reign forever and ever." Now, I believe that this is demonstrating Israel in the past becoming the church in their age. right? Because you have a physical nation on earth that had a capital, it had a place that everyone lived, and their lives revolved around that one place. But now you have that becoming the kingdom of Christ. When that happened was whenever the church came and was established, right? And he shall reign forever and ever. Christ did not begin to reign as a king in the same sense that he did, or this, I boogered that up. Christ began to reign in a way that was different from the establishment of the church onward, right? Because the church was established and is his kingdom. It is different than Israel, completely different. Different set of laws, different set of rules to accompany those laws. So whenever you see this, I believe it's a reminder that that is what happened. It's the same thing we see back in chapter 7 with the small number coming out of Israel and then a large nation of Gentiles becoming members. They fell down, the 24 elders fell down and worshiped God. And look at what they say. I think that my position is backed up by the tail end of verse 17. You have taken your power and begun to reign. There's a starting point here, and that's what they're referencing of when Jesus began to reign. Look at the tail end of verse 18. And the time for the dead to be judged. This is again looking forward to the resurrection and for rewarding your servants, the prophets and the saints, those who fear your name, both great and small. We get a small snippet of Judgment Day in this one verse. Look at verse 19. Then God's temple in heaven was opened, and the ark of his covenant was seen within his temple. That is a very important phrase, within his temple. There were flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, and an earthquake and heavy hail. When you go back to the Exodus account, you have God, after the tabernacle is built, his presence would come down, and it would be in the form of a great cloud hovering over the tent. Whenever he spoke to them from Mount Sinai, it was with loud thundering and lightning happening, and it was terrifying to the people that witnessed it. We see the power of God here, and we see God dictating something down to the people. But that was a significant moment, because when that happened, whenever he was on Mount Sinai, speaking down to them, terrifying them with the method that he was doing it, he was telling them, you are going to be my people, and I'm going to be your God. I am entering a covenant with you, and that was the point that that covenant was entered. He said, you will be my people from this point on. And they were up until the establishment of the church. So whenever we see this here, we see the temple. Now the Israelites didn't have the temple at this point. The tabernacle hadn't even been formed at this point when God was speaking down to them from Mount Sinai. But what is the temple today?
Church.
The church, right? The temple is the church. Where was the Ark of the Covenant whenever it was made? Where was it to be kept? Constantly.
Within the temple.
All right? Within the tabernacle at the time it was made, and then the temple after the temple was made. Where at in the tabernacle or temple? Bonus points.
Holy of holies.
All right, the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. What was in the Ark of the Covenant? More bonus points, since we're not going to get chapter 12 now.
It's a body, right?
Nope,
No? Not a body.
that's the mummy.
Aaron's staff.
All right, Aaron's staff was in it. Aaron's staff was special because whenever the Israelites were grumbling, they wanted to have a democratic leader, pretty much. God, through a miraculous set of circumstances, made Aaron's rod blossom. Right? It was an almond branch, if I remember correctly, an almond staff, and it budded out. Completely impossible to do without the help of God. But God was proving his leadership, who he wanted to lead in the Ark of the Covenant. We see that today in the church as well, because God has said who he wants to lead in the church. What else was in the Ark of the Covenant?
Anna.
Showbread, right? Not showbread. Showbread was outside the Ark of the Covenant. Part of the manna that was given by God to the Israelites to support them through miraculous means whenever they were starving in the wilderness. All right, we have the bread of life, the Bible, provided for the church today. What else?
I remember that touching it killed you instantly.
Yes, you weren't allowed to touch it. But there was one more thing inside of it that was important.
I want to say like the original Ten Commandments on
The
tablet.
2 tablets
Yeah.
that God had written the laws on, they were contained in the Ark of the Covenant. That signified that God had given them the law and that they were expected to follow it. The same thing is expected of the church today. He has given us the law of the new covenant, and we are expected to follow it. But what did the Ark of the Covenant, that is what was inside of it, what did the Ark of the Covenant represent?
God's throne. He can sit on it.
Okay, God's presence is what I'm after, but you're right. Whenever you sit on a throne, you're present on it. It represented God's presence. Whenever the Israelites would go out into battle, what would they do a lot of times?
They would take the ark with them.
They took the ark with them. A lot of times without asking if that's what God wanted or not. They would pack the ark along with them because they viewed the ark as the presence of God. If they took the ark, then surely God had to go along with them. They didn't understand that that's not how it worked. God isn't physically attached to the Ark of the Covenant. It was just a representation of his presence. Whenever it was treated correctly, it showed that God was present with those people. And the same thing, the Ark of the Covenant is seen here in his temple. God is present in the church today. Whether we realize it or not, whether we doubt him or not, God's presence is within the church today. We have that company that should give us solace and faith that no matter what happens, we have God there in our corner in the church.
Whenever God wasn't with them, didn't the ark get stolen?
Um,
Was it?
one time, I don't know how long Eric's going to go, but we'll tell this story. One time they packed the ark off to fight the Philistines, right? And they thought, this is our magic lucky rabbit's foot, pretty much, is how they were treating the ark at that time, because they were in a very horrible, sinful state. So, Eli's sons are the ones that packed it off. They get stomped in battle. Eli's sons are killed. Eli dies. The ark is stolen by the Philistines. Whenever a messenger runs up, whenever Eli heard that the ark was stolen by the Philistines, he fell over backwards and broke his neck because he was a very fat man. One of my favorite verses in the Old Testament. He was very fat. Fun to tell the girls that story because we'd put pillows under our shirts and act like fat people that fell over and broke our necks. Didn't be Eli. So, whenever that happened, the Philistines had the Ark of the Covenant. They take it into their temple. Ashdod, I believe, was their idol. And Ashdod was like a fish-human mashup because they lived over by the Mediterranean Sea. So they go in the next morning, and Ashdod has fallen over. This huge idol has fallen over in front of the ark. So they stand it back up. The next day they walk in, and it's fallen over and broken into pieces. And then God begins to strike them with emerods, is how the King James describes it. Or some describe it as tumors. I have read that it really means hemorrhoids. Really terrible hemorrhoids is what it means. So all of these people are struck with this affliction. And so they start playing hot potato with the Ark of the Covenant. They take it over here. They take it over here. They take it over here. They send it back over here. We don't want it. And so finally, they build this special cart. Get these special heifer oxen. Strap the oxen to the cart. Put the Ark of the Covenant onto this cart. And just let it go. And the oxen walk right back into Israel. And they go the whole way waving by, take your terrible luck with you. So the ark gets delivered by the power of God and the power of God alone back to the Israelites.
That's kind of funny.
Later, The Ark of the Covenant is really interesting. I love talking about the Ark of the Covenant. Later, Indiana Jones did not find it, contrary to popular opinion in the 20th century, but it was destroyed or hidden and then deteriorated whenever Nebuchadnezzar came in. Either Nebuchadnezzar came in and melted it down for the gold and destroyed what was inside, or Jeremiah or another follower of God hid it, and it has deteriorated over time because it is, after all, a gold-covered wood box, and wood rots if it's buried. So,
No.
all right.
Well,
I just heard
Indiana
that
Jones
people.
found it.
I just heard that people had found pieces of that.
That is like the cross. I have heard that if you took all the pieces of the cross that people claim to have found, you could build an entire wooden ship. And you could build a freightliner with all the nails that people claim that were the ones that nailed Jesus to the cross. So,
Yeah, I would think that the only way you could truly tell if you found it or not is if you touched a piece and decreased your lifespan.